Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another of our daily Pride Month decks. This is deck number 19 and it's titled Trans-Planar Partners. And if you've missed the first few episodes of this, what we're doing is building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering using two non-partner commanders, working with a budget of $100 or less, and using this as a way to celebrate the diversity of the LGBTQ+ community for every single day in June. So today, our two partners are going to be, according to the wikis, I don't know too much about these characters, I'll be perfectly honest, two canonically trans characters in Xantcha, Sleeper Agent, and Cadira, Caller of the Small. Now you'll also notice that both of these two are from different planes of existence, Xantcha being, I believe, from either Dominaria or Mirrodin, and then Cadira being from the D&D world, so I believe it's the Sword Coast. I'm not 100% sure the name. Again, I don't know much about these characters. But the important part is that they are both, according to the lore, trans characters, and are a great example of what we can do with representation in the game. So to start off with, our two commanders, we have Xantcha, Sleeper Agent, 1 black-red for a 5/5 legendary creature Phyrexian minion. Xantcha, Sleeper Agent, enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. Xantcha attacks each combat if able and can't attack its owner or planeswalkers its owner controls, and you can pay 3, and Xantcha's controller loses 2 life and you draw a card. Any player may activate this ability. Cadira is 1 green-white for a 3/3 legendary creature Orc Ranger. She's got trample, and whenever Cadira deals combat damage to a player, for each token you control, create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. So you may notice that these two are in completely different colors, being red and black and green and white, and they actually don't interact with each other all that much. So we had to figure out a good way to connect these two commanders, and I think we did a pretty decent job when we look at our themes for the deck. So first up, our themes are going to be tokens. We really want to lean into Cadira's ability to make a ton of tokens, and we also can kind of use Xantcha's ability as a way to point our opponents at each other, and meaning that we don't have to use our tokens to block, we don't have to use our tokens to defend ourselves, we can keep accruing those tokens. And a great way to make the tokens is with Hangerback Walker, which is XX for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. Hangerback Walker enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. When it dies, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker, and then you can also pay 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. So this itself obviously is not a token, but it is a great way for us to generate tokens and start to go wide, and then hopefully, with Cadira, make even more tokens on top of that. Now, you may also notice that the tokens it creates are in fact artifact tokens, and that is going to be the key to our second theme of the deck, which is artifacts. So with all of these different artifact tokens entering and possibly leaving and everything going on, we want to make sure that we are benefiting from it. So to that end, we have Arcbound Condor, which is 2 black for a 0/0 artifact creature bird. It has flying and modular 3, so it enters with 3 +1/+1 counters, and when it dies we can put those counters on another artifact creature. And most importantly, whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until the end of turn. Artifacts are usually going to be a little bit bigger and be a little bit harder to get into play, but because we're focusing on tokens and Arcbound Condor doesn't specify that the artifact has to be non-token, we can kind of just flood the board with a ton of artifact tokens, trigger the Condor, kind of just wipe out our opponent's boards, and then we're able to just send our creatures in, do a ton of damage, and just kind of knock our opponents out while we're doing it. And the nice thing about Arcbound Condor is that it targets a creature, which means that if we've given away Xantcha, it will not be killing our Xantcha because we can choose what's going to get the -1/-1. Moving on to our final theme of the deck, this is sacrificing our artifact tokens for probably a lot more value. So a good example of that is Legion Extruder, which is 1 and a red for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target, and you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice another artifact to create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. So this can essentially turn our little 1/1 Thopters or treasure tokens or anything else like that into 3/3 golems, which is going to be very powerful, but it also triggers some of our sacrifice synergies, which are also in the deck. So basically, our main game plan here is to make a ton of artifact tokens, use them to trigger our abilities, sacrifice them to trigger other abilities, and then run over the table with all of our tokens. Plus, we still have the added benefit of if someone has Xantcha, we have a card draw engine right there on the table, so we can refill our hand if we need to. That, though, is the end of our themes for today, and the next thing I want to do is take a look at some key cards in the deck. These are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in a lot of cases are kind of the main engines to the deck. So our first key card that I want to highlight is going to be Yoshin Dissident. And Yoshin Dissident is a green and a white for a 1/1 human artificer. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Normally, when you see these types of effects, it will specify whenever one or more artifacts enters under your control, or when a non-token artifact enters under your control. This specifies neither of those things. So if we go super wide and say Hangerback Walker makes us 10 Thopters all in one sitting, then we get to put 10 +1/+1 counters divided as we choose among our creatures. The nice thing about having artifact creature tokens is that they will enter and trigger the Dissident and can actually get the counters put on themselves. So instead of having an army of 1/1 flyers, we could have an army of 2/2 flyers, which doesn't sound like a huge upgrade, but the difference between a 1/1 and a 2/2 in Commander is actually pretty significant. And even beyond that, we could put all of our counters onto Xantcha if we control Xantcha, which is probably not likely, but it's always a possibility. We can put them on Cadira to make sure that she can get into combat damage. We can put them on any evasive creatures. We can even put them on Hangerback Walker itself, so it makes more creatures when it dies. This is one of those cards that looks pretty unassuming, but is actually incredibly powerful for our deck. Moving on to our next key card. In this case, we have Thousand Moon Smithy. This is one of those cards that came out relatively recently. I say that, but it's probably over a year now. But it is a ton of fun. I love this card. I try to squeeze it into every artifact deck that I can. It is 2 white for a legendary artifact. When it enters the battlefield, create a white gnome soldier artifact creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. And at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may tap 5 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control. If you do, transform the smithy, and when you transform it, it turns into Barracks of the Thousand, which is a legendary artifact land. It taps for a white mana, and whenever you cast an artifact or creature spell using mana produced by Barracks of the Thousand, create a white gnome soldier artifact creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. Oh, that is a lot of words on one card, but this is an incredibly powerful card because it creates a creature, and possibly multiple creatures if we flip it, that scales with our board. So if we have 5 artifacts, it is a 5/5. It is not unlikely in this deck for us to generate an absolutely absurd amount of artifact tokens, and if we're doing that combined with making these gnome soldier tokens, they will get incredibly big incredibly quickly, and our opponents can only block so many things before the rest of them chip away at their health. So that is keycard number 2, and moving on to keycard number 3, we have Oni Cult Anvil. And this is a card that I wasn't thinking too much of when I put it into the deck, and then after a little bit of playtesting with the deck, it's surprisingly efficient at what it does. So Oni Cult Anvil is a black and a red for an artifact. Whenever 1 or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn, and you can tap it to sacrifice an artifact and it'll deal 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So unfortunately that triggers only once each turn clause is stapled to this card, which is unfortunate, but I think it's still good enough with that because we can essentially sacrifice an artifact, do a damage to each opponent, gain a life, and replace that artifact with a construct token, kind of netting us neutral other than gaining life. But it will also trigger all of our ETB effects, it'll trigger all of our dies effects, it'll trigger the artifact synergies, so it really just kind of keeps churning, and it's a great way to activate our abilities without pretty much any input from ourselves. It's just 2 mana, and then the rest of it is free from there. Anyway though, that is the end of our key cards for today. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. And these are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in a lot of cases are just kind of fun cards that I want to highlight. So the first pair of cool interactions is going to be between Kibo Uktabi Prince and Pain Distributor. So Kibo is 2 and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature monkey noble, and it can tap and each player creates a colorless artifact token named Banana with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add red or green, you gain 2 life. Then, whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that's an ape or a monkey. Plus, whenever Kibo attacks, defending player sacrifices an artifact. I feel like I picked all the wordy cards for today's deck tech, but Kibo, incredibly powerful. It's great to make more artifact tokens so we can get some bananas, and it cares about our opponent's artifacts going to the graveyard. In a similar vein, we have Pain Distributor, which is 2 and a red for a 2/3 Devil Citizen. It's got Menace. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, they create a treasure token, and whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Pain Distributor deals 1 damage to that player. So if we give our opponents either a banana or a treasure, and they sacrifice it, we will be putting a +1/+1 counter on every single creature we control that's an ape or a monkey. I believe it is just Kibo, but I haven't looked at every single creature type, so who's to say? And we get to do 1 damage to the person who sacrificed it with Pain Distributor. So as long as we are continuously having these 2 cards in play, no matter what our opponents are doing, they are probably playing into our game plan. Plus, worst case scenario, we also get the banana and we also get the treasure, so we can make these artifact tokens with different names. That's going to be very important to our game plan. Moving on to our second cool interaction. This one is going to be between Vishgraz the Doomhive and Rhea Ivor, Bane of Bladehold. Now I know, before I start talking about these cards, we have a lot of people with very strong opinions on Infect, so I will acknowledge that yes, we do have a minor Infect theme in the deck, and that is because a lot of the Phyrexian Might tokens that they just recently came out with in things like 1 and everything else, they are artifacts, and therefore they are cards that we want. So Vishgraz is 2 white, black, green for a 3/3 legendary creature Phyrexian insect. It's got Menace and Toxic 1, and when it enters the battlefield, create 3 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. Then, Vishgraz gets +1/+1 for each poison counter your opponents have. And this pairs incredibly well with Rhea Ivor, Bane of Bladehold, which is 2 white black for a 3/4 Phyrexian Knight. It has Battle Cry, so whenever it attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, the next time target creature would deal combat damage to 1 or more players this combat, prevent that damage, and if damage is prevented this way, create that many 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So essentially what we can do is if we have Vishgraz, which will come in, it will make 3 artifact Might tokens, and if we hit someone with all 4 of those creatures, they will get 4 poison counters. Vishgraz will then get +4/+4 for each poison counter. Now, in theory, if we can distribute 9 poison counters to each opponent, putting them just one shy of death, that is the maximum number we could get. So that would put us at 27 poison counters, which means that Vishgraz then becomes a 30/30. That's already very good, obviously. However, then we can trigger Rhea Ivor and say that Vishgraz won't deal combat damage this turn, it'll be prevented. However, because it would prevent 30 damage worth of damage, it will then create 30 Phyrexian Might tokens. Now, obviously, this is like the absolute ceiling of what these two cards can do, because that is most likely never going to happen, but it's a great way to generate a ton of tokens, and then as you generate those tokens and give out more poison counters, Vishgraz gets bigger, which then lets you generate more tokens to do more poison and get Vishgraz even bigger, and there is a world where you just win the game with poison, even though that is not our primary game plan. However, if your table is not a fan of poison, then maybe mention this beforehand or even take these cards out. There's a couple of other poison cards in here, so be aware of that going into this deck. That, though, is the end of our cool interactions, so the last piece of this deck is to take a look at the price of the deck. And today, we came in at $58.70, with our most expensive card being Illustrious Wanderglyph at a massive $9.98, and if we're being honest, it is definitely worth it, because Illustrious Wanderglyph is 4 and a white for a 2/2 artifact creature golem. It has Ascend. Other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2 as long as you have the city's blessing, and at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature token. This card does everything we want it to be doing. It's pumping up our creatures, not just once but twice, going to +2/+2, and it's making a gnome every single upkeep, not our upkeep, every upkeep. So that means that if there are 4 players at the table, we will, by the time it gets back around to our turn, have 4 gnomes that this thing created. Now, the way that that would math out is if we are assuming we have 5 lands in play because we spent 5 mana on the Wanderglyph and nothing else, then we could play the Wanderglyph, puts us to 6 permanents in play. We go around the table, we make 4 gnomes, that puts us to 10, we now have the city's blessing, all of our artifact creatures get +2/+2, and we can just start beating down our opponents with a massive gnome army. So, and that is base level. There's so much more that could be done. So I do want to highlight Illustrious Wanderglyph because I do think it's very worth it in the deck. However, if you need to trim for budget purposes, just cutting out this one card does drop the total deck price down below $50, which is a much better number to be sure. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching today's deck tech. That does bring us to the end of it, and as always, a huge shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members. If you are interested in supporting the channel, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond, you can also find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. So, once again, thank you to everybody for watching this video. Thank you to all of the support on our previous Pride Month decks. I hope you all have a wonderful Pride Month this year, and I will see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.